In June 1940, the French Air Force ceased to exist. Not through attrition, through the specific, catastrophic way that only total national defeat produces. The country fell, the government surrendered, and the aircraft that remained were either captured, destroyed on the ground, or flown by pilots who refused to accept that the war was over. The pilots who refused flew west. Some flew to North Africa. Some flew to Britain. A few flew wherever their fuel would take them, because landing, surrendering the aircraft, becoming a prisoner, was not acceptable to men who had been in the air when France fell and intended to keep flying. The Groupe de Chasse 2/5 Île-de-France was one of the units that kept flying. By 1941, GC 2/5 was operating under British command, attached to the RAF, flying British aircraft with French cockades on their fuselages and British unit codes. Under those codes, French pilots, flying for a France that no longer officially existed, from bases in a country not their own, against an enemy occupying their homes. The aircraft they flew was the Supermarine Spitfire. The Spitfire was not simply the aircraft that happened to be available. It was the specific expression of a philosophy of air combat that the French pilots absorbed and made their own over 4 years of operations. The philosophy was this: the fight is won in the turn. The Spitfire's elliptical wing was an engineering solution. Maximum surface area for lift at low speeds, minimum drag for high speed in level flight. The result: a wing that allowed the Spitfire to turn inside almost any contemporary aircraft, to go where other aircraft could not follow, to reverse direction faster than an opponent could anticipate. In a turning fight, the Spitfire was nearly unbeatable. German pilots who had encountered it during the Battle of Britain understood. The Spitfire could not be followed into a turn. Pursuing it into a turning engagement was a tactical error. The correct response was to use the Messerschmitt's superior dive speed to disengage and re-engage on German terms. By 1944, the FW-190 had partially addressed the turn problem. The Spitfire Mark IX, introduced in 1942 with the more powerful Merlin 61, responded in kind. A rough equilibrium of capability in the air over France. But equilibrium had a specific limitation. The Spitfire's effective combat radius was approximately 200 miles. 200 miles was enough to reach the French coast from England, enough to cover the Normandy beaches on D-Day, enough to escort bombers to targets in northern France and Belgium. It was not enough to reach Germany. For GC2/5, for pilots who had been flying from British bases since 1941, watching France be liberated piece by piece from aircraft that could not fly far enough to see all of what was being recovered, this limitation was not merely tactical, it was personal. Germany was where the war would be decided. Germany was where the Spitfire could not go. While GC2/5 flew Spitfires over France in 1944, a different conversation was happening inside the Luftwaffe. Adolf Galland was General der Jagdflieger, commanding general of the German fighter arm. The problem, as he saw it, was not courage or training, it was the aircraft. When Goering asked his pilots what they needed to defend Germany, Galland gave an answer that Goering found infuriating. He asked for a squadron of Spitfires. Not because German aircraft were worthless. The Bf-109 and FW-190 were excellent. But the Spitfire's specific combination of turn, climb, and ceiling gave it tactical flexibility that German fighters had not been able to fully neutralize in 4 years of trying. Goering was furious. He accused his pilots of cowardice. He did not give Galland his Spitfires. And in the winter of 1944, something appeared over the Western Front that Galland found more troubling than the Spitfire had ever been. Something American. Something with a Merlin engine. Something that did not fight like the Spitfire at all. On October 13, 1942, a Spitfire and a Mustang took off from a Royal Air Force base and climbed to high altitude. Both fitted with the same engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61. The Spitfire Mark IX with the Merlin 61 was, in the autumn of 1942, the best version of the best British fighter in the war, the aircraft against which everything else was measured. The other aircraft was a North American Mustang. In 1940, the British asked North American Aviation to build them Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. North American declined and offered to design a new fighter in 120 days. They delivered the prototype in 102. The original Mustang, with its Allison V1 710 engine, was a disappointment at altitude, excellent at low levels, could not compete with German fighters above 15,000 feet. Then someone asked the obvious question, what if we put a Merlin in it? The Rolls-Royce engineers who ran the calculations were astonished by their own results. The Mustang's laminar flow wing was more aerodynamically efficient than anyone had appreciated. The projected speed with the Merlin 61, nearly 430 miles per hour at altitude, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version, faster, on paper, than the Spitfire 9. Test pilot R.N. Liptrot reviewed the calculations and refused to believe them. The idea that a brand new American aircraft could outperform the Spitfire struck the RAF establishment as almost an affront. They flew the test anyway. On October 13, 1942, both throttles were pushed to maximum. The Spitfire pilot, flying the finest British fighter of the war at emergency power, watched the Mustang accelerate away from him. The Mustang disappeared into the distance. Not gradually, not a close race. At 25,000 feet, on the same engine, the Mustang was 25 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire 9. The laminar flow wing that Liptrot had dismissed turned out to be exactly as efficient as the North American engineers had calculated. One observer wrote, "Soon we shall have a scream for Mustangs instead of Spitfire 9s." In October 1943, more than 9% of 8th Air Force bomber sorties that reached their targets did not return. The escort fighters, P-38, P-47, were excellent but limited. Neither could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustang could. With drop tanks, the P-51D had a combat radius of more than 750 miles. Berlin was 600 miles from the English bases. The Mustang could fly to Berlin, fight, and return, something no single-engine fighter in the world could do in 1944. The Bf-109 could stay over Berlin approximately 10 minutes before fuel required return. The Mustang could stay for 30. In those 20 additional minutes, the war in the air over Germany changed. By early 1944, P-51s were escorting bombers deep into Germany. Instead of staying close to the bombers, Mustangs ranged ahead to find and destroy the Luftwaffe before it could form up for attacks. Adolf Galland personally flew a captured P-51 after it was recovered intact from a crash landing. His assessment? The P-51 was the most dangerous Allied fighter. Not the Spitfire, which he had wanted, the Mustang, which he had not anticipated. By the winter of 1944, GC-2/5 had been flying Spitfires for 3 years. 3 years of the turning fight, of the dance, of an aircraft that had become less a machine than a habit of thought. On a cold morning on a recently liberated French airfield, they walked out to the dispersal area and found aircraft they did not recognize. Long nose, bubble canopy, 6.50 caliber guns in the wings, the distinctive scoop under the fuselage that housed the Mustang's radiator. An American technical sergeant was standing next to the nearest aircraft. The pilots looked at the Mustang. Somewhere over Germany, Galland's pilots were flying against an enemy they increasingly did not understand. An enemy that was not fighting like the Spitfire, not turning into the carousel, not playing the game they had trained to defeat. An enemy that was choosing when the fight would start, and when it would end. The American technical sergeant who stood beside the Mustang that winter morning was a mechanic, not a philosopher of air combat. His job? Explain the Packard V1650 engine, the American-built Rolls-Royce Merlin that powered the P-51D, and answer questions from French pilots who had never flown it. The engine's quirks, the 6 M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, the bubble canopy that gave 360-degree visibility. The engine in the Mustang was, in its essential design, the same engine the French pilots had been flying for 3 years, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, built under license in the United States as the Packard V1650. Built in factories that had been producing automobile engines 18 months earlier. The engine was familiar. The aircraft was not. The Spitfire's cockpit was narrow, intimate, every control within reach, every instrument visible, the pilot sitting almost inside the fuselage itself. A cockpit pilots described as wearing rather than sitting in. You put on the Spitfire the way you put on a glove. The Mustang's cockpit was American, larger, bubble canopy higher, giving unobstructed 360-degree visibility that the Spitfire's framed canopy could not match. Instruments in different places, throttle with a different feel, different undercarriage, different ground handling. For a pilot who had been flying the Spitfire for 3 years, the Mustang's cockpit was recognizable in its general outline and alien in every specific detail. The transition was not simple. The Spitfire had trained its pilots to think in terms of the turn. A Spitfire pilot assessed every situation through one question: can I get into a turning engagement on favorable terms? The Mustang's fight was energy, speed, altitude, and the options they created. Accelerate to disengage, climb to gain altitude advantage, dive to build speed for a single decisive pass. Energy management was the philosophy that matched the Mustang the way the turning fight matched the Spitfire. The Mustang's laminar flow wing gave it 440 miles per hour in level flight, but did not produce the Spitfire's roll rate and low-speed maneuverability. The Mustang could not outturn a Spitfire. In the classic turning fight, the engagement the French pilots had trained for and mastered, the Mustang was at a disadvantage. But the classic turning fight was not the Mustang's fight. The sergeant explained the fuel management system, the propeller pitch control, the trim settings for cruise. The understanding of what the Mustang required would come in the air. For GC2/5, the winter of 1944 was a period of relearning. The first flights in the Mustang were familiarization, take off, get a feel for the handling, land without bending it. The Mustang was not forgiving on the ground. Its narrow undercarriage and the Merlin's torque on takeoff required specific technique, and the French pilots initially found the ground handling unnerving. In the air, the Mustang revealed its character in stages. First, the speed. Level flight speed on the Spitfire Mark IX, approximately 408 miles per hour. The Mustang, at 25,000 feet, 437. 30 miles per hour does not sound like much. In air combat, it is the difference between a shot and no shot. Second, the range. On a Spitfire, fuel awareness was constant. Perhaps 90 minutes of flight time in normal operations, less in combat. Pilots returning from missions over the French coast managed their fuel with the anxiety of men who knew exactly how far they were from home. On the Mustang, the same calculation produced different results. More than twice the internal fuel of the Spitfire. With drop tanks, jettisoned before combat, the Mustang could fly for 8 hours. The French pilots who had been counting every gallon over the English Channel were suddenly flying an aircraft that could cross Germany twice. Not to the French coast, to Berlin and back. On the German side, the tactical problem was becoming clear to pilots who had no philosophical framework for describing it. The Bf-109 pilot who had learned to exploit his aircraft's superior dive speed found that the Mustang could dive with him. The energy built in the dive, which had always created separation from Spitfires, did not create the same separation from the Mustang. The Mustang came with him, and it came faster. The first combat mission for GC2/5 in the P-51 Mustang took place in early 1945. The briefing was standard: escort bombers to a target inside Germany, provide cover during the bombing run, engage any Luftwaffe fighters that appeared, return to base. Deep penetration into German airspace, sustained presence over the target area, expectation of enemy contact. For pilots who had been flying Spitfires over France for 3 years, the geography was different in a way that mattered. On a Spitfire, a mission to Germany meant calculating fuel to the edge of the envelope, choosing between staying with the bombers and having enough fuel to return. If combat developed at the wrong moment, the math that got you home might not work. On the Mustang, the same mission profile had margin, fuel to spare, time to spend. The flight to the target was uneventful. Bombers in formation, escorts, American P-51s and French Mustangs, above and to the flanks, scanning for enemy aircraft. The Rhine Valley passed below, then the German industrial heartland, then the target, inside Germany, beyond the range a Spitfire could reach and fight and return from. The bomb run began. The Mustangs held position. And then, from higher altitude, the Luftwaffe appeared. Bf-109s, perhaps a dozen, diving from altitude toward the bomber formation in the classic German tactical approach. Use the altitude advantage to build speed, make a single high-speed pass through the formation, and then use that speed to climb back out before the escorts could engage. It had worked in 1943 and early 1944, when escorts could not stay with the bombers deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe would wait until the escorts turned back, then engage the undefended bombers. But the escorts in early 1945 were not turning back. The Mustangs turned into the diving German fighters. For the French pilot flying his first combat mission in the P-51, the engagement began the way every engagement had begun in the Spitfire. Assess the geometry, identify the turning solution, position for the carousel. The German fighters were coming in fast. The correct response, in Spitfire terms, was to turn into them, force a turning engagement. He started the turn. And then something, instinct, the accumulated understanding of what the Mustang was and was not, made him stop. The Mustang did not want to turn into the carousel. It wanted to do something else. He pushed the throttle forward. The Packard Merlin responded. The Mustang accelerated. Not into the turn, into the dive. In a Spitfire, this would have been a mistake. The Bf-109 had always had better dive performance. Following a 109 into a dive was how you lost the engagement. In the Mustang, the dive was different. The laminar flow wing that could not match the Spitfire's turn demonstrated what it had been designed for: speed. The Mustang accelerated in the dive faster than the Bf-109. He was catching the German fighter, not turning inside him, not outclimbing him, catching him in a straight dive on speed alone. The German pilot, who had learned that diving away from a British fighter created separation, looked back and saw the Mustang still there. Closer than it should have been. He pulled up. The French pilot followed. The energy from the dive converted into altitude. The Mustang climbed. Not the sustained climb of a carousel, but the energy-driven zoom climb that trading speed for altitude produces. At the top, the French pilot had position, altitude, energy advantage. He fired. The engagement was over in seconds. Back at base, the pilots compared notes. One veteran, 3 years in the Spitfire, the turn learned and mastered, said what they were all thinking. On the Spitfire, you dance with the opponent. On the Mustang, you choose when to start the fight and when to end it. By the spring of 1945, the air war over Germany had clarified into something that the Luftwaffe High Command understood with professional precision, but could not effectively counter. The problem was not the quality of German aircraft. The Bf-109G and the FW-190D were excellent fighters, well-armed, well-built, flown by pilots who had survived years of combat. The problem was not German tactics, refined through 5 years of operations. The problem was the Mustang. The problem was what the Mustang allowed. Stay with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way back, and still have fuel and altitude to hunt German fighters before, during, and after the bombing run. In 1943, Luftwaffe defensive doctrine assumed that Allied escorts would turn back at a certain point. The Luftwaffe would position its fighters along the route, wait for the escorts to leave, then engaged the bombers in mass formations. October 1943, Black October, saw bomber loss rates approach 10% per mission. The statistical life expectancy of a bomber crew, 10 missions. The required tour, 25. The P-51 changed the math. By early 1944, the escorts were not turning back. Luftwaffe fighters that had positioned themselves to attack undefended bombers were instead engaged by Mustangs that had range to spare, altitude advantage, and the speed to dictate terms of engagement. The speed advantage was not enormous. The P-51D at 25,000 feet was perhaps 25 to 30 miles per hour faster than a Bf-109G. But the advantage was persistent across the entire altitude band where combat occurred, cumulative across missions that could last 6 or 7 hours. 30 miles per hour, sustained across a 2-hour engagement, was the difference between a Mustang pilot who could choose when to engage and when to disengage, and a German pilot who could not refuse combat on unfavorable terms. By late 1944, Luftwaffe fighter units had been instructed to avoid combat with escorts and focus exclusively on bombers. The directive, destroy bombers, not achieve fighter victories that do not prevent bombs from falling. But the directive could not be executed when the Mustangs would not allow it. P-51s ranged ahead of bomber formations, hunting for German fighters forming up. When they found them, they engaged before the Germans could reach the bombers. If the Germans attempted to disengage, dive away, and reform, the Mustangs followed and re-engaged before they could recover position. German pilots in the spring of 1945, in interrogation reports after the war, described American fighters as everywhere. No altitude, no position, no approach route safe from P-51s that could engage on equal or better terms. Not strictly true in the physical sense, not enough Mustangs to cover every cubic mile, but the perception was tactically accurate. The Mustang's range meant it could be present across the entire depth of a mission's route. Its speed meant a German pilot who saw a Mustang could not be confident of avoiding combat. The psychological effect was significant. Pilots who can disengage from unfavorable combat take tactical risks. Pilots who cannot refuse combat become cautious. Caution produces defensive flying. Defensive flying produces fewer effective attacks on bombers. By spring 1945, bomber loss rates had fallen to levels that made the strategic bombing campaign sustainable. The 8th Air Force, losing aircraft at rates that threatened daylight bombing in 1943, was losing less than 2% per mission in early 1945. The Mustang had not single-handedly won the air war, but it had changed the tactical equation in a way that made the air war winnable. Gallen said after the war that the P-51 was the most dangerous Allied fighter because it combined the range to escort bombers to any target in Germany with the performance to fight on equal terms with the best German fighters. He did not say this about the Spitfire, which he had asked for and been denied. He said it about the Mustang, which had appeared over Germany in numbers the Luftwaffe could not match, and with capabilities German doctrine had not anticipated. For the French pilots of GC-2/5, the spring of 1945 was a period of continuous operations over Germany. The missions were no longer defensive patrols over France or the English Channel. Deep penetrations into German airspace, bomber escort to the Ruhr, Bavaria, industrial cities that had been untouchable from British bases in 1943. The Mustang made it possible. The Spitfire would have made it impossible. The tactical experience of flying the Mustang in these operations was cumulative and transformative. Each mission added to the pilot's understanding. Each understanding changed how they approached the next mission. First understanding: range. Not the abstract knowledge that the Mustang had more fuel than the Spitfire, but the lived experience of crossing the Rhine, flying another hour into Germany, fighting over the target, flying back, and landing with fuel still in the tanks. Fuel that meant the difference between "we need to turn back now" and "we can stay." Second understanding: speed. Not the specification of 30 miles per hour faster, but the tactical reality that when a German fighter appeared, the Mustang pilot could accelerate to close the distance or extend it, could choose whether to fight now or fight later. Third understanding, altitude. The Mustang's performance above 25,000 feet, where the two-stage Merlin maintained power that other engines lost, meant that climbing to altitude was not a compromise, but a tactical advantage. Higher was faster. Higher was more options. Fourth understanding, harder to articulate but defining. You do not need to win the turning fight if you never enter it. The Spitfire trained its pilots to win the carousel. The Mustang trained them to avoid it entirely. Make a pass, extend, climb, reassess. If the geometry is favorable, make another pass. If not, extend again. Use altitude and speed to reset the engagement on your terms. German fighters, designed to exploit the Spitfire's need to turn, found that the Mustangs were not cooperating. The Mustangs would not stay in the turn. Single high-speed pass, then gone. Climbing, extending, repositioning. When they returned from altitude, with speed, with energy advantage the German pilot had no effective counter for. In interrogation reports of German pilots captured in spring 1945, this pattern appears repeatedly. The American fighters would not fight. They would engage, disengage, re-engage from positions the German pilot could not predict or prevent. The frustration is professional and precise. We understood how to fight the Spitfire, but the Mustang does not fight like the Spitfire. For GC2/5, this tactical evolution was not taught in a classroom. It was learned in the air, mission after mission. One pilot described it in terms that became the squadron's unofficial doctrine. On the Spitfire, you dance with the opponent. On the Mustang, you choose when to start the fight and when to end it. By April 1945, GC2/5 was flying missions over Germany almost daily. Railroad yards, airfields, troop concentrations. 6 hours, 7 hours, sometimes more. The fuel that would have grounded a Spitfire after 90 minutes was still available after 5 hours. The specific advantage this gave French pilots who had spent 4 years flying for a France that did not officially exist. They were finally flying over Germany. Not over the French coast, watching Germany from a distance they could not close. Over Germany itself. The Mustang gave them the range to see Germany from above, the speed to fight on equal terms, the altitude to choose the engagement. After 4 years of exile, the specific capability the Spitfire could not give them, the ability to take the war to the enemy's homeland, not just defend against it from a distance. France had fallen in 1940. In the spring of 1945, French pilots were flying American aircraft over German cities, and the German fighters that appeared to contest them could not refuse the fight. The Spitfire had given them the dance. The Mustang had given them the choice. The question that defined the final months of the air war over Germany was not whether the Allies would win air superiority. By early 1945, that question had been answered. The Luftwaffe was still fighting, still producing aircraft, still training pilots, still launching interceptions, but defensively, reactively, with diminishing effect. The question was, how quickly can the Luftwaffe be destroyed as a fighting force? The answer determined the pace of the ground war, the casualties sustained in the advance into Germany, the duration of the war itself. The P-51 was not the only factor in achieving air superiority, but it was the factor that allowed the pace of destruction to accelerate beyond what any other Allied fighter could sustain. The reason, the Mustang could stay over Germany. Not for a single mission, for the entire day, in rotation, across the entire depth of German airspace. In early 1944, before the P-51 arrived in numbers, bomber missions to Germany assumed escorts would turn back at a certain point, and the bombers would proceed unescorted. The unescorted portion was when losses were highest. The Luftwaffe knew when and where the escorts would leave. They positioned their fighters accordingly. They waited. They attacked. By mid-1944, with P-51s escorting, there was no unescorted portion. The escorts stayed. Luftwaffe fighters positioned to attack bombers after escorts left found themselves engaged by Mustangs that had fuel to fight altitude to choose the engagement, speed to dictate terms. This tactical shift was not incremental, it was categorical. For the bombers, escorts all the way to the target and back meant loss rates dropped from statistically certain death within 10 missions to statistically survivable across a full tour. The difference between a campaign that could not be sustained and a campaign that could. For the Luftwaffe, attacking bombers was no longer waiting for escorts to leave. It was fighting through the escorts before reaching the bombers. And if you fought through and reached the bombers, the escorts followed, engaged again and again, until you disengaged, or ran out of fuel, or were shot down. The specific tactical innovation P-51 units developed was area superiority. Instead of staying close to the bomber formations, the Mustangs ranged ahead, sometimes 50 miles ahead, looking for German fighters forming up. When they found them, they engaged before the Germans could reach the bombers. Tactically possible only because the Mustang had the range to operate that far from the bombers and still have fuel to return. A Spitfire ranging 50 miles ahead over Germany would not have had fuel to return. The Mustang did. The effect? Move the air battle forward, away from the bombers, away from the point where German fighters could do damage. The Luftwaffe found itself fighting not over its intended targets, but over the forming up points where its fighters were assembling. Fighting at those points meant burning fuel before the attack even began. By spring 1945, German fighter pilots interviewed after the war consistently reported that fuel, not aircraft performance, not pilot skill, not tactics, was the limiting factor. They would form up, climb to altitude, find themselves engaged by P-51s before they reached the bombers. The engagement would burn fuel. If they disengaged to conserve fuel for the bomber attack, the P-51s followed and re-engaged. If they stayed and fought, they burned through the fuel they needed to return. The tactical problem had no effective solution within the constraints of German fighter range. The Bf-109 and FW-190 had been designed for short-range interception, not for extended engagements against escorts that could stay with them for the entire mission profile. The P-51 had been designed exactly for that, and by the spring of 1945, the P-51 was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, keeping the Luftwaffe away from the bombers and destroying German fighters at a rate that the Luftwaffe could not replace. The air war was not over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. For GC2/5, the war ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with a series of missions that became progressively less contested. In March 1945, French pilots were still encountering German fighters on most missions. In April, encounters became less frequent. By early May, German fighters appeared rarely, and when they did, they disengaged quickly, diving away, extending, refusing combat. The tactical roles had reversed. The German fighters were now the ones choosing when to fight and when to flee. The Mustangs had the energy, the altitude, the fuel to pursue or not as they chose. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. GC2/5 had been flying continuously since 1940. 5 years. Fall of France to occupation of Germany. British bases to liberated French airfields to missions over German cities. Spitfire to Mustang. The transition from Spitfire to Mustang had not simply been a matter of learning a new aircraft. It had been a matter of learning a new philosophy of air combat. The Spitfire taught maneuver to win, turn inside your opponent, control the geometry through superior roll rate and tighter turn radius, the dance. The Mustang taught energy to win, control altitude, control speed, choose when the fight begins and when it ends, the choice. For pilots who had spent 3 years mastering the Spitfire's philosophy, the Mustangs initially felt wrong. The instinct when a German fighter appeared was to turn into it, force the carousel, win the way they had been trained. The Mustang required them to suppress that instinct, not turn when every hour of training said turn, extend when instinct said engage, climb when the immediate tactical situation seemed to demand a horizontal solution. Months of missions to internalize the new philosophy. Months of making a pass, extending, climbing, reassessing. Months of watching German fighters dive away and learning not to follow, but to climb above them and wait. months of discovering that fuel-burned climbing was fuel well spent because altitude was options. By spring 1945, French pilots were flying the Mustang the way the Mustang wanted to be flown, not the way the Spitfire had been flown, the way the aircraft's combination of range, speed, and high-altitude performance allowed. After the war, some pilots of GC2/5 were asked which aircraft they had preferred, the Spitfire or the Mustang. The question was not as simple as it seemed. The Spitfire had been the aircraft of survival, flown when France did not exist as a combatant nation, when the future was uncertain, when every mission was flown from bases in a foreign country, the aircraft of exile. The Mustang had been the aircraft of return. That had taken them back over France, then over Germany. That had the range to reach the enemy's homeland and the performance to fight on equal terms, the aircraft of offense. One veteran put it in terms that became the squadron's collective memory. The Spitfire was the most beautiful aircraft I ever flew. The Mustang was the best. Beauty was the elliptical wing, the narrow cockpit, the intimate connection between pilot and machine. The aircraft that responded to the smallest input, that turned where you looked. Best was range. Best was speed. Best was the ability to stay over Germany for hours, to engage on your terms, to choose when to fight and when to leave. Best was coming home with fuel in the tanks after a 7-hour mission. Best was the aircraft that let you take the war to the enemy instead of defending against it from a distance. The Spitfire had given GC2/5 the means to survive the war. The Mustang had given them the means to win it. France had fallen in June 1940. French pilots kept flying. British aircraft from British bases under British command, with French cockades that signified a country that no longer officially existed. In spring 1945, those same pilots flew American aircraft over German cities. They escorted American bombers. They engaged German fighters on terms the Germans could not refuse. When the war ended, they returned to France, not as exiles, but as victors returning to a country they had helped to liberate. The Spitfire taught them to dance. The Mustang taught them to choose. The choice they had made, to keep flying, to accept the Mustang, to learn the new philosophy, to take the war to Germany instead of defending from a distance, was the choice that brought them home. The North American P-51 Mustang was not, in 1940, the aircraft anyone had planned to build. It was the product of specific circumstances that would not have occurred if the British had not needed fighters urgently, if North American had agreed to build the P-40 under license, if someone had not asked the obvious question about putting a Merlin in an American airframe. The Mustang was not designed by committee or long-range planning. It was designed in 102 days by a team working under deadline to produce an aircraft that would meet British requirements for multiple roles: air defense, ground attack, reconnaissance, without being optimized for any single one. The result was an airframe that had, almost by accident, exactly the characteristics that would make it the finest long-range escort fighter of the war. The laminar flow wing produced performance at high altitude that exceeded what the designers had predicted. The internal fuel capacity turned out to be exactly large enough to allow drop tanks that would extend the Mustang's range to more than 1,600 miles. The Packard Merlin integrated with the airframe in a way that produced performance that surprised the test pilots in October 1942. None of this was planned. It was the result of good engineering, good fortune, and the accident of timing that put the Mustang into production exactly when the Allied air forces needed an aircraft with exactly the capabilities the Mustang happened to have. By 1945, the P-51 had become the standard against which all other fighters were measured. Not because it was the fastest, the Me-262 jet was faster. Not because it was the most maneuverable, the Spitfire could turn inside it. Not because it had the heaviest armament, the P-47 carried more guns and bombs. Because it combined range, speed, altitude performance, and ease of production in a way no other aircraft did. The Spitfire could match the Mustang's speed at some altitudes and exceed its maneuverability at all, but could not match the range. The P-47 could match the armament and exceed durability, but could not match the efficiency. The Me-262 could exceed the speed by a wide margin, but could not be produced in the numbers the Mustang could. The Mustang was not the best at any single thing. It was good enough at everything that mattered. This is a different kind of excellence than the Spitfire represented. The Spitfire was optimized for a specific mission: air defense, close-range interception, the turning fight. Did that mission better than any other aircraft. The Mustang was optimized for flexibility: escort bombers, sweep ahead to clear the route, strafe ground targets, fly reconnaissance, do all of these in a single sortie and still have fuel to return. This flexibility was what the Allied air forces needed in 1944 and 1945, not the perfect interceptor. The aircraft that could do all the missions that needed to be done. By war's end, more than 15,000 P-51s had been built. They equipped most fighter groups in the 8th and 9th Air Forces. They escorted bombers to Berlin and beyond. Not because they were the best at any single aspect of air combat, because they were good enough at all of them. The French pilots of GC2/5 understood this distinction. The Spitfire had been the aircraft they loved. The Mustang had been the aircraft they needed. Love and need are not the same thing, but in war, need is what wins. In June 1940, France fell. French pilots who refused to accept the defeat flew west. They joined the RAF. They fought for a country that no longer officially existed. For 3 years, they flew the Spitfire, the elliptical wing, the narrow cockpit, the dance. In winter 1944, they found American aircraft waiting on a liberated French airfield. Long nose, bubble canopy, the distinctive scoop under the fuselage, the Mustang. They learned the new philosophy: energy over maneuver, altitude over position, choice over dance. By spring 1945, they were flying over Germany. Not over the French coast, watching from a distance they could not close, over Germany itself. The Mustang gave them the range to reach Germany, the speed to fight on equal terms, the altitude to choose the engagement. After 4 years of exile, the ability to take the war to the enemy's homeland. The Spitfire had given them the means to survive. The Mustang had given them the means to win. On a spring morning in 1945, a French pilot from GC2/5 took off from a liberated airfield in France in a P-51 Mustang. The mission was escort. Bombers to a target in Germany. The same mission profile he had flown dozens of times in the Spitfire, dozens more in the Mustang. This mission, the last combat mission he would fly before the war ended, clarified something all the previous missions had been teaching him. The difference between the Spitfire and the Mustang was not technical. The specifications mattered: the range, the speed, the altitude performance, all of these were real, all had tactical consequences. But the fundamental difference was philosophical. The Spitfire had been designed around a specific theory: the fight is won in the turn. Maneuverability is the decisive advantage. The pilot who can turn inside his opponent will win. This theory was not wrong. In the context for which the Spitfire had been designed, short-range interception, air defense, close combat over friendly territory, the theory was correct. The Battle of Britain validated it. German pilots learned that turning with a Spitfire was a mistake. But the theory had a limitation. It assumed both aircraft would engage in the turn, that both pilots would accept the turning fight as the arena in which the engagement would be decided. The Mustang rejected that assumption. The Mustang's theory was different. The fight is won by the pilot who controls the conditions of engagement. Speed, altitude, and range are not simply advantages within a turning fight, but tools for avoiding the turning fight entirely, or for entering it only on terms that favor you. Make a pass, extend, climb, reassess. If the geometry favors you, make another pass. If not, extend again, climb again. Use altitude and speed to reset the engagement on your terms until the geometry is favorable or the opponent disengages or runs out of fuel. This was not cowardice. It was choosing when to fight and when not to fight, choosing the moment of engagement based on advantage rather than proximity. German fighters that had learned to fight the Spitfire, to dive away, to disengage when the turning fight was unfavorable, to use altitude and speed to reset, discovered that the Mustang fought the same way. That the tactics developed to counter the Spitfire did not counter the Mustang because the Mustang was already using those tactics, and the Mustang did them better. Faster climb, better high-altitude performance, more fuel to stay in the fight. The French pilot understood this in a way that could not be taught in ground school. He had flown both aircraft. He had learned the Spitfire's philosophy and mastered it. Then he had learned the Mustang's philosophy and discovered it was not an evolution of the Spitfires, but a replacement for it. On the Spitfire, you danced with the opponent. On the Mustang, you chose when to start the fight and when to end it. The mission was uneventful. The bombers reached the target. The German fighters that appeared were few and disengaged quickly. He returned to base with fuel still in the tanks, fuel that would have been gone hours earlier in a Spitfire. When the war ended days later, he had flown his last combat mission in the Mustang. He would remember the Spitfire as the most beautiful aircraft he had ever flown. The narrow cockpit, the elliptical wing, the aircraft that responded to thought as much as to touch. But he would remember the Mustang as the aircraft that had won the war. Not because it was more beautiful, because it was more capable. Because it had the range to go where the war needed to be fought. Because it had the speed to fight on equal terms. Because it had the altitude performance to choose the engagement. Because it gave him and the other French pilots who had flown without a country for 4 years the ability to take the war to Germany instead of defending from a distance. France had lost its sky in 1940. In the spring of 1945, French pilots flew American engines over German cities. They flew at altitudes the Spitfire could not sustain. They flew at ranges the Spitfire could not reach. They engaged German fighters on terms the Germans could not refuse. And when the fight developed, they chose when it would start and when it would end. The Spitfire had taught them to dance. The Mustang had taught them to choose. The dance had kept them alive. The choice had won the war.